I'm super happy to be introducing Dr. Sunshine Menezes, who, as Mona has mentioned, is a former Sea Grant Canals Fellow. She's currently the Executive Director for the Metcalf Institute at the University of Rhode Island, where she's also a Clinical Associate Professor in Environmental Communication. And Dr. Menezes has a PhD in Biological Oceanography and has spent the better part of her career engaged in science communication, which has culminated in her position now within Metcalf. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Metcalf, Metcalf Institute has a really strong reputation for training journalists, scientists, and environmental communicators worldwide to better report and engage in science and environmental issues. This includes hosting the annual Inclusive SciComm Symposium, which focuses on how we communicate science through the lens of equity and inclusion. So in that light, Dr. Menezes will be sharing with us today some of the ongoing research looking at the landscape of inclusive science communication, who's doing it, why, what are some of the challenges and opportunities in this field, and then we'll discuss later on kind of how this will apply to some of our efforts here at Sea Grant. So with that, I welcome Dr. Sunshine Menezes. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand it off to you now.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Mona and Meredith. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I especially appreciate all of you joining us today. It's crazy out there, so really glad that you're willing to share some of your time today to learn more about this inclusive science communication work. I'm going to share my slides here, and hopefully this will work well. Can everyone see my slides? Yes? Good. Okay, great. Wonderful. So I thank you also, Meredith, for explaining what Metcalf Institute does. That means I don't have to. So we're at the University of Rhode Island, and we have been really trying to focus on making science communication inclusive for a long time, but we have taken a deeper dive into this in the last few years, and so I'd like to share with you what that looks like and what we're learning. I'd also like to acknowledge that this work that I'm going to share today has been done in collaboration with my colleague Kaytee Canfield, who's a postdoc at the US EPA lab here in Narragansett, Rhode Island. She's just been an incredible collaborator. I also want to note that the landscape study that I'll be talking about was funded by the Kavli Foundation, and we're grateful for their support. So, okay, let's see. Okay, good. So this all started a couple of years ago in 2018, when Metcalf Institute launched the Inclusive SciComm Symposium, and you can find more about this at inclusivescicomm.org. We decided to do this in the fall of 2018. Well, we started in the winter of 2018, really, or 2017 rather, because we were recognizing that there were a number of people who were really focusing on making their science communication efforts inclusive, but they were doing this in silos. And we thought, well, it would be really great to bring these people together so that many people all together can learn more about what it means to do inclusive SciComm and recognize that there are already people doing this and that there are good models to follow. So that's what launched the first symposium in 2018. We had about 150 people from all over the country who came to that. Some of the people were, in fact, already really leaders in inclusive SciComm. Others just came because they wanted to learn more about it. By day 2 of that 1.5-day program, there were so many incredibly positive responses that we decided we were probably going to have to do this again, even though that wasn't actually what we were thinking when we started it. It was really just an experiment. And so we did this for the second time last fall and increased our participation by about 25%. We added a poster session, we added a second keynote. We really are growing quite a bit because there's so much interest in building this community of people across disciplines, across sectors, across career stages, who really want to learn how to do science communication in ways that are inclusive and equitable. That all led to the publication of a paper earlier this year called what you see right here in front of you, that was published in Frontiers in Communication. This is open access, so you can find this at your leisure. And this, my co-authors on this were mostly the people who were involved in planning, all the people on the planning committee from the 2018 symposium. as well as Kaytee Canfield, who was actually a graduate student at URI at the time, who became really engaged in the project, and Cynthia Taylor, another graduate student at URI, who helped with the paper. So this paper was our way of kind of putting a flag down and saying, hey, everybody, it's time for science communication to really shift toward a critical approach that, as we wrote, centers inclusion, equity, and intersectionality. So we have a very long definition of inclusive science communication in that paper, but I'd like to kind of lay out for you what this means. So first of all, when I say science communication, I am using the broadest possible definition of that term, meaning this incorporates everything from formal science education in a classroom to many different types of informal science learning, whether that is happening after school or in museums or via social media, or many, many other approaches. So we're taking this very broad look at that. In terms of the inclusive piece of this, that reflects a real paradigmatic shift in how we conceive of science communication, a shift that would bring us toward a form of science communication that recognizes the history of oppression and discrimination against many communities, that centers the voices of marginalized individuals and communities, that recognizes that a given person's characteristics overlap, meaning their race, their gender, their ability, their sexual identity, whatever. All of those things overlap, and it's those intersectional identities that affect our status in the world. This approach towards science communication also acknowledges that the explicit and implicit biases of science communication practitioners and scholars affects how we actually develop our science communication activities. It also says that we want to take an asset-based approach toward communication, meaning rather than focusing on what people don't know or don't bring to a conversation, we're going to think about what they do bring to a conversation. And the fact that diverse ideas and experiences and even criticisms of science enrich science itself, enrich the process of scientific research, and should inform the way we communicate about that research and its implications for our daily lives. And finally, no small thing here, we're suggesting that inclusive science communication is a way to address systemic problems of access to STEM. So we're offering kind of a grand vision here, and that was the idea, and we expect that there will be some criticisms of this and some pushback, and that's fine, that's the way it's supposed to proceed. But we really want to step out of the box and offer something that's really new and exciting. So in addition to that, we have some data that I wanted to share from the first symposium that I think is important. This is from the 2018 symposium, and these data are summarized in a second paper that is also in Frontiers in Communication that was published earlier this year by Holly Smith and others. And these two figures here show you the changes in how people rated themselves in terms of their knowledge about various inclusive SciComm topics before in blue and after in orange, attending the Inclusive SciComm Symposium. And what you see, the kind of the big picture here is that, can you guys see my cursor? Meredith, can you see that? Okay, good. So what you see is that before the symposium, the people who said that they were either extremely or very knowledgeable about these various things was, it was fairly low, and it increased after they attended the symposium. Okay, so that's great. What I think is even more important is that the people who said that they were slightly or not at all knowledgeable about these various aspects of inclusive science communication, such as their ability to identify challenges to inclusive SciComm, identify opportunities, implement strategies for inclusive SciComm, overcome barriers, or the last one is identify new ways to become engaged in inclusive SciComm. Those people who said they were slightly or not at all knowledgeable and there were a lot of them before the symposium, that decreased quite a bit after attending. So the upshot is this symposium is absolutely a valuable way for people to share knowledge, share ideas, develop new partnerships. And that's a pretty exciting thing. We also found, and again, I should note that Holly Smith at University of Oregon led this analysis of the surveys. She found that there were 3 main response orientations, as she called them, among symposium attendees from their participation in the symposium. And those response orientations she described as either emotional, knowledge-based, or action-based orientations. So with regard to the people who said they had emotion sort of orientations, those emotional responses were both positive and negative, as you can tell from these quotes. So this one person said, it's almost overwhelming to realize how far we have to go in some respects with regard to doing science communication in inclusive and equitable ways. A second person said, this meeting was very powerful and motivating for me personally. Okay, so that's great. Lots of emotional, positive and negative responses there. With regard to knowledge, I wanted to share this long quote because it encapsulates some of the kind of growth that was involved for many of the participants. This person wrote, access and the barriers on that road of accessibility are so much more treacherous, winding, and uncharted than I originally thought. I was uncomfortable for most of the symposium and felt out of place. This was an enlightening step toward recognizing what needs to happen if things are going to change in science communication. And finally, some people who had more of an action orientation said things like, I both know and can identify more of the barriers to inclusive science communication, but I also feel like I have more tools and strategies to overcome those barriers. So it's that idea of tools and strategies that could lead people to do something differently as a result of attending the symposium. And another person said, I'm going forward, as I go forward, I will use my connections and my privilege to raise up the voices and experiences of minority scientists. So we clearly have a lot of really valuable outcomes from this symposium, and that led us to think, boy, there is a lot that we need to understand about what is going on in this evolving sphere of people who are doing what we're describing as inclusive science communication. So the Kaytee Foundation gave us a grant to look into this, and it's so the Kaytee Foundation has supported a few of these grants that they call landscape studies. And the idea is it's kind of a snapshot looking at a relatively small number of leaders in a particular topic area. In our case, we were interviewing 30 leaders that are working across many different disciplines and sectors and modes of science communication. This involved both researchers and practitioners, and again, a lot of different settings. And I want to note that Kaytee Canfield did all of the interviewing on this and has done most of the data analysis too. So 30 interviewees mostly informed the results that I'm going to share with you. But given the fact that that's such a small number of people, we've also been sharing these results at meetings in small groups. So we had some focus groups at the 2019 Inclusive SciComm Symposium to ask specific questions related to these the landscape survey that we had developed. And we've also kind of tested out our initial findings at a couple of conferences to see if any of the people in those groups at these various conferences had different thoughts than what we had found, or if they could expand our understanding in different ways so that we can ultimately have this, we're taking this sort of iterative approach toward developing the report that will come out of this, that we will finish this summer, to make it as useful as possible. Okay, so that's why and how. And so now I'm going to share with you some of the findings from this study. most importantly, we have identified these key traits of inclusive science communication, and we're not sure yet if we're going to call them key traits or core principles. So I'm going to call them key traits today, but I just want to kind of offer that up for your consideration. And those are intentionality, reciprocity, and reflexivity. So let me go through those one at a time. Intention refers to your intention as a communicator when you are undertaking any sort of science communication or public engagement activity. So who is your audience? Are you really thinking about them and their needs and their interests? How are different identities represented and supported in your science communication efforts? Does this effort account for history, the historical oppressions and discriminations that I referred to earlier? With regard to reciprocity, and I should note that this is an idea that was mostly brought up by the practitioners that we spoke to and not so much the researchers. This really refers to mutual benefit between whomever is kind of leading or driving the communication effort and whomever the audience is. So mutual benefit, an asset-based approach like I described earlier, that is really acknowledging the values that your audience brings to the table. And also reciprocity involves dialogue. This is not a one-way thing at all. This is really truly a dialogue that could even address some very important and foundational questions, such as what defines science, quote unquote. And the idea is that there are different ways of understanding the world and different ways of knowing, or even like, who is a scientist? Those of us who work in STEM fields in various ways are often trying to build a broader sense of belonging in STEM. So the fundamental question about who constitutes a scientist is a part of that, and part of being reciprocal in your thinking about your communication. And finally, reflexivity. This was something that pretty much everybody has mentioned. And this is about the idea that you have to have this intention when you're going into your science communication in terms of what you're trying to do and who you're representing and all of that. And you need to have this reciprocity. But the reflexivity is about having done this effort, really thinking critically about it. Did I achieve what I set out to do? Was I truly inclusive and equitable in that work? And how can I improve my practices for the next time so that we are on this continually improving trajectory? I'll note that with regard to reflexivity, sometimes this was an initial motivation for some of the leaders that we interviewed for the study. Sometimes that idea of reflexivity came out as an epiphany in the course of their work. Also, reflexivity is something that can be done by institutions, but is much more commonly done by individuals, not surprisingly. Okay, another major finding from this report, this study, and this is not going to be very surprising to people, is the fact that those of us doing science communication, and especially within inclusive science communication, this field or movement or whatever it is that is evolving right now, it's very siloed. And those silos are numerous, but I will focus on the silos that I've identified here. We are very siloed by our disciplines, I should say. And that's because there are so many different disciplines that really inform good science communication, but often people don't have the time to really learn as much about those different disciplines and how they could and should inform our work. And therefore, we tend to fall into a particular disciplinary silo. There's also a lot of siloing because of the mode of our science communication, which is to say, are we doing science communication, say, via Twitter, which many people are really doing inclusive SciComm that way. But those people who are very active in the world of Twitter are not necessarily active in the in-person science festival world, for example, so or in the modes that you all across the Sea Grant network are working in. So those modal silos really limit how much we can learn and apply good practices from other modes. And then finally, another set of silos that's really important here are the silos of practice and research. And I expect that you all on this call are probably more likely to understand this than some might be, because you really bridge the practice and research worlds a lot. Many of you are actively doing science communication for your job, and you either are a researcher or are working with researchers all the time. But what we found in the study is that especially the younger folks who are working in this inclusive SciComm sphere are really struggling with this kind of dichotomous idea of practice versus research. They really see themselves as at different kind of points along a spectrum between practice and research at different times, depending on what they're doing. So the ways that we talk about practice versus research often presents additional siloing that is not very helpful. Some of the novel insights that have come out of this study include the fact that our silos are reinforced by language, that language that is often taken for granted in our various sub-communities. So the upshot of that is that, you don't know what you don't know. So we often can't even think to look outside of our silos, because we don't have the language to look outside of our silos. And that's significantly limiting our ability to learn from one another. Similarly, language is an important signal to potential collaborators. And this very same problem of language reinforcing the silos is making it harder to develop partnerships that could really do something novel and potentially really impactful. Another one of the big findings is that a number of people who are really leading at the leading edge of inclusive science communication suffer from a lack of belonging. They really feel that they're kind of neither fish nor fowl. They feel that they don't necessarily belong within the contributing disciplines that inform their work, or the contributing communities. And Kaytee Canfield noted in thinking about, in analyzing all of this, that's probably one of the reasons that there is so much humility among the people who do this inclusive science communication work, because there's a recognition that we're doing the very best we can in the moment, but that's not necessarily the best way to do it. So there is this understanding that the knowledge and the practices really need to improve, but we still have to do the best we can with what we have right now. And finally, career stage is a really important point too. There are a really wide range of early career leaders in inclusive science communication. They're bringing an entirely different set of assumptions, fresh approaches, and insights that could accelerate the field if only we would give them the opportunities to do that. Okay, so let me summarize a couple of the challenges that we have identified. Some of these are not going to be terribly surprising. There's a very limited understanding right now of what constitutes inclusive science communication practices. So many people fear they just don't know what they're doing, apropos of what I said before about people kind of making this up as we go along. So the fear is that, and especially people that come from a science background who really want to operate according to evidence, right? But there's a real lack of evidence related to inclusive SciComm right now. There's just not a lot of research on it. And the research is so spread out across such disparate disciplines that people are really struggling with that. Which brings us to the idea of training. Of course, one could overcome this through education and training, but there's a void. There is a significant void in training opportunities whether it's pre-career for students or professional development right now, to build competencies in inclusive science communication. And that's a real problem for a number of reasons, but not least that people want to know how to do this, and they want to know how to do it right now. Many people then are looking for kind of lists of tips and tricks, but inclusion in any setting, and science communication is no different, is largely about relationships and deep engagement with people. It's not about easy tips and tricks. So this need for training is a really big gap right now. It's also noteworthy that there is a very imbalanced representation in leadership in inclusive SciComm, and that's largely based on gender. So it is mostly women who are really leading the charge in this regard. And we have to have diverse leadership, not just by gender, but race and ethnicity and ability and all kinds of things. We really need diverse leadership in this evolution of inclusive science communication, or else we risk perpetuating this very same inequalities that this is supposed to address. And infrastructure. So often, again, when it comes to all DEI work, there will be an institution or an organization will say, here's our quote unquote diversity person. Here's our one person who is going to do this work for us. Yeah, great, wonderful, yeah, yes, patting ourselves on the back. But this is not the work of one person. This requires an institutional commitment. But the institutional infrastructure doesn't really exist for that sort of commitment right now, and that's something that needs to be addressed. Funding, I add up here as like the last thing. I'm not really going to talk about it because funding's always a challenge for everything, right? But and right now it's probably going to be ever more a challenge in the not too distant future. But one of the extra challenges with funding when it comes to inclusive SciComm is that doing this work takes more time because of the deep engagement and the relationship building that I mentioned before. And that means longer horizons for funding, which is challenging for many funders. So that's another thing to consider. Okay, a couple of pressure points that we found that we think could really stimulate the field. One of them is framing our science communication efforts in a way that really invites interested and relevant parties, meaning we want to help more people see themselves as part of this bigger effort to change science communication for the better. So that means we need to think really carefully about the language that we use to make this broader invitation. We also need more opportunities and actually physical and virtual spaces for the learning and networking that needs to happen to grow this field. Some of this is going to be online, some via social media. I'm biased, but obviously I think the Inclusive SciComm Symposium is pretty great, but it has only happened once a year. And in fact, we're now moving to an every other year model just because Metcalf Institute is small and we're very time limited. So we need to think of other ways to really advance these conversations and keep the momentum going. Speaking of momentum, this is something that a number of our interviewees noted, especially those people who are finding institutional resistance to their work to do inclusive science communication. So the challenge is, in spite of the fact that a person or a program may be doing really great work as an inclusive science communicator, their institutional leaders may say that they want change, but the institutions are not necessarily committing the time or the money or the effort that this kind of work requires. And then another pressure point here is, and this was only noted by a couple of people, is that we really need to get more creative about evaluation of this stuff. And those of us who are doing science communication without, who maybe are practitioners and are not thinking about evaluating our programs as much, we really need to start thinking differently about this so that we can get more data to actually substantiate and build credibility for inclusive approaches. All right, so I want to wind up here with some promising practices based on what we've found. I'll note that that term, we're using that instead of recommended practices, because one of the interviewees made a point of saying that he feels promising practices is a much better term until we have more data, and I agree with him. So first of all, let's make sure that we're embedding those key traits or core principles in all of our science communication practices. Intentionality, reciprocity, and reflexivity are the things that we need to be thinking about all the time and coming back to them over and over again and checking ourselves to see if they're happening. We also need a process or processes, depending upon the work that we do, for adaptive implementation of those key traits based on our communication goals, our audiences, and our settings. So this could be program specific or it could be organization specific. You know, from a Sea Grant perspective, it could be project specific even, you know, but it's something we need to think about. And I urge you to think about that in your own work. Of course, we need to critically analyze our language to reflect those key traits and to keep breaking down those silos. I love this cartoon. I use it all the time. You know, again, this gets back to the point that we, all of us, no matter what work we do, we tend to fall back onto our comfortable language, and that comfortable language may not be even recognizable to another person. And I'll note, and I'll give you a really contentious example right now. So the word outreach, which I know Sea Grant uses all the time, and many people, cooperative extension from the land grant world uses this term all the time. Outreach as a word is the antithesis of inclusive science communication. It's because it assumes a hierarchy of knowledge, you know. We in the academic community, for example, are going to reach out to you people who are not in this community. So I know that that's kind of a jarring thing to hear. I've had this conversation with a few other people, but it's an example of how we take language for granted, and we need to question our language. Another promising practice is to really learn from equity-focused education research. They have been doing incredible work in multicultural education and using like critical race theory and critical disability theory, all these things to inform how science education happens in formal settings. There's a lot that we can learn from them for informal settings as well. And I just wanted to note that I was reading this book, Race, Equity in the Learning Environment, for a book club at the University of Rhode Island just over the past couple of months. And while it's focused on formal learning environments, there is so much in here that is relevant to my work related to inclusive science communication. So there's a lot out there, and I recommend that if you're interested in this, you look into the many resources that are available. Another promising practice is, of course, to create and sustain these in-person and online networks. And why should we do that? Because it helps to cultivate a sense of belonging across disciplines and across modes. It helps to promote interdisciplinarity. And it also helps to, build credibility of this work of inclusive science communication, but also to help everybody recognize that this spectrum of practice and research is essential, and all parts of the spectrum are really important, not one versus the other. We need to create these curricula for training related to inclusive SciComm. This photo here is Sam Dyson, who led a workshop about having difficult conversations at our 2019 Inclusive SciComm Symposium, and people raved about it because it was hard but it was a really useful exercise. So we need to develop a lot more training opportunities like that, whether they're for students or for professionals. We need to create more leadership opportunities for the students and the early career professionals who are coming up with all kinds of great ideas. The people featured in this photo are Evelyn Valdez-Ward here and Rob Ulrich here, who are both graduate students that run a program called Reclaiming STEM, which is a science communication and science policy training workshop that is for underrepresented graduate students and developed by underrepresented graduate students. So it's incredible. It's met with incredible positive responses from people, and they're an example of people who are, you know, early career folks who are doing really great work. We need to value and validate these diverse methodologies so that we can move beyond this researcher practitioner binary. A lot of the early career folks, as I noted, are straddling this kind of divide and really feeling a lot of guilt about it, especially those who've been trained as researchers and now want to go on to a career in science communication. So we need to talk about this more and try to come up with different ways for it to think about what it looks like in practice. And then finally, we need to really think more creatively about collaborative approaches for evaluation, so we can build up the base, the foundation of data that we need to learn more about the value of inclusive SciComm. So to sum this all up, inclusive science communication, the practices that are involved in this are not necessarily new. There are a lot of people across all of these different disciplines and sectors and modes who've been doing much of this over time. What's new about this is that this is a call for really integrating all of these disparate efforts. And if we do that, we're going to end up with something that is much greater than the sum of its parts, that's going to enhance learning and minimize duplication and improve outcomes. And if we manage to achieve all of that, we're going to have this radical rebranding of science communication. That was a quote from one of our interviewees in the study, that will make science communication accessible by default, that will transcend the kind of single definitions of science and expertise that we often tend to work with, and that will find these mechanisms to recognize and learn from the similarities and differences in how we do our work. Thinking back to the silo idea, and now switching that metaphor a little bit, we've been talking about inclusive science communication as kind of an open floor plan with fewer walls that are lower so you can see over them. So you can like talk to your neighbor who has this totally different approach and share information. Funny, like office jokes now feel so quaint, right? But that's okay. So that's my office metaphor. Now, finally, I want to complete this with one last comment, and that is that COVID-19 offers some vivid examples of the need for inclusive science communication. So the images that I've shared here are from a comedy variety show that Caveat NYC put on a couple weeks ago now in New York. It was called Asians Strike Back, a coronavirus comedy and science show. And this was organized by a couple people who really wanted to address the fact that there are a lot of very racist and racialized comments and approaches toward communication about COVID-19. They also wanted to counter misinformation about the science. So this is science comedy that is addressing very difficult conversations. This is inclusive SciComm in a nutshell. And there's another example of this. This is from Twitter. Monica Feliu-Moher has been on the planning committee for the last 2 inclusive SciComm symposia. She's a neuroscientist by training, but she's a really important contributor to the world of inclusive science communication. And she's involved with a program called Ciencia Puerto Rico, or Ciencia PR. And Ciencia PR works with scientists from basically anyone who relates to the Puerto Rican diaspora, wherever they are, to help communicate about science. So per these these tweets that she offered a couple days ago, she said that what she's really been doing over the last few days in response to COVID-19 is serving as an editor and liaison, helping young scientists and SciCommers get their op-eds and articles published via Ciencia PR in collaboration with their media partners. And she makes a note in this second tweet here that these were all published in Spanish and from a culturally relevant perspective focused on Puerto Rico. So, and this is just one of many articles that she shared in that thread. So culturally relevant science communication, which reflects language, it reflects culture. That is another approach toward inclusive science communication that is relevant always, but here's a particular example based on what we're experiencing right now that's very relevant. And so I'll leave you with a couple of thoughts that I'd love to hear from you about. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, but I wonder how you're thinking this relates to or corresponds with or conflicts with your work at Sea Grant, and also what resources or training or other things you think you need to advance inclusive science communication. And with that, I'll close and say thank you.
That was terrific, Sunshine. Thank you so much. So colleagues, please use the chat function to ask questions. That is probably the best way to proceed. Meredith and I will moderate this question answer session. So as you type your questions, I did receive a couple via email. So Meredith, Sunshine, is it okay if I share them? And Meredith, you can continue to monitor the chat window?
Yes, I will do that. And actually, while people are kind of gathering their thoughts, one thing I wanted to note was, Sunshine, when you made that comment about outreach, because I just was mulling over all sorts of things in my head. And I don't know if I went to the SciComm, the Inclusive Symposium, but I feel like you guys did something else. And you know, there are just certain things where you're like, oh, you realize that you're doing something and you're like, oh, that's not good.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also in the middle of redoing our website and I'm like, what do we call outreach? Is that a word we still use? But I wasn't thinking of it in this lens. I was just more like, does that mean anything to anyone? But so I'm like, okay, great. We won't use that. But the question I have in light was, you know, through your own process, what was a big, I think I would assume other people could relate, is when you have every good intention and you want to do better, and then you learn something of your own that your own habits that you realize, and that's I think the hardest part, when you're like, oh, I'm not as good as I had hoped I would. So I was just wondering, from your perspective in all this research, what was the one thing that kind of hit you where you were like, oh, yes, okay?
Oh, that's such a good question, Meredith. Wow, that's such a good question. Boy, you know, I could come up with a whole bunch of things, I'm sure, but rather than bore you with all of the things that I do wrong all the time, let me offer this. We all mess up, you know, like we all, even with the best of intentions, we do things and say things that are not inclusive or equitable. And what I think is most important is to acknowledge that to yourself, and if appropriate, to another person. Like if you realize you said something that in fact, in second thought, you're like, oh, wow, that in fact might have been offensive. I recommend that you just say that. I am so sorry. I just realized maybe that was really an inappropriate thing to say, and I'm sorry. And if you're up for it, and this is very hard, if you're up for it, you could even go into a conversation, and if that person is up for it, go into a conversation about that difficult thing. This is exactly the kind of training that we need, that we don't get. Having those hard conversations, especially across difference, whatever that kind of difference is so important and so hard to do. And I feel like to get to where science communication needs to be, those of us who are doing this work need to have the skills to do this. So, but we're not there yet, and you can't expect yourself to just, Zoom, be an expert in this. So I urge you to, be kind to yourself, but acknowledge if in fact you have said or done something that is not, it's not the best way to proceed, and learn, and be willing to learn. So humility is a huge part of this. Just acknowledge that none of us is perfect, and that's okay. We're humans. We're not supposed to be perfect, but we can get better.
All right. Well, thank you, Sunshine. So I request colleagues to type your questions, and we still have 12 minutes. And if we're not able to get through the questions, I'm sure that Sunshine will oblige us by answering those questions, and we'll post them online. But the question I got via email, Sunshine, is from a colleague at University of Michigan. They are a general programmer analyst for their research institution, where they do a lot of coding, and they distill science into the purest logic possible, and using all the tools. Their question is, what would you recommend research programmers and software developers to do to improve their professional practice along the lines of inclusive SciComm?
Oh, that's a great question too. So this is, I'll admit that this is definitely not my area of expertise, but I do know that there are more and more people who are really thinking carefully about coding, and like this comes up a lot in artificial intelligence work, I know, but trying to recognize and address the implicit bias that goes into coding that can have so many ill effects on many people. So there are people out there who are thinking about this and are experts on it, and I urge you to look for resources. I know that there are resources out there that specifically address this issue. So I'll try to, I just can't come up, there's one particular website that's in my head right now, but I can't come up with the name of it, but I'll try to come up with that and share it with Mona, so she can distribute it later.
Thank you, Sunshine. Meredith, do you want to field some questions?
Sure. Another question's concerning any helpful tools to help with applying the DEI lens to fact sheets, websites, publications being developed by Sea Grant. Some of the, this one is in questions in particular to a group of voters, but I think this is relevant to all of the various groups that Sea Grant interacts with. So yeah, I'll end it there.
Absolutely, that's a great idea. So I'm finding a link right now that I'm gonna put into the chat. There are a couple things that I'm thinking about. One is the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education, CASE, had a broadening participation task force a couple years ago that I was on. And we developed, and so I just shared the link, we developed a bunch of practice briefs, they were called, that are designed to spark conversations about many, many, many different aspects of broadening participation in your workplace. And so that's one thing you could do when it comes to developing fact sheets. Like these briefs, which cover a whole bunch of different topics, raise some issues that you can ask yourself and your colleagues about as you're developing any kind of communication tool. The other resource that I wanted to share is if you go to inclusivescicomm.org, which is the website for the symposium, on the homepage, there's a blue button toward the bottom that says resource list or something like that. So that is a crowdsourced Google Doc, which you can add resources to as well. It has this long list of, there's categories and then many, many, many different resources under those categories. And there could also be additional tools and resources listed there that could be helpful for you. Another thing I want to mention, and there was an interesting, so the National Association of Science Writers and the Open Notebook, which is a great website resource about science writing, they launched a series, like a blog post series called Diverse Voices, maybe a year or 2 years ago. And it addresses all sorts of issues related to DEI in science writing. And one of the things recently, a recent blog post was about sensitivity readers, meaning if you are writing a piece either for a particular like marginalized community, or like to reach this community, or if you just want to just kind of check in general about the language that you're using, you could reach out to a person, compensate them, reach out to a person who would serve as a quote unquote sensitivity reader to give you like some insight, a person who is not the same as you, you know, like who's of a different ethnicity or gender or ability or whatever, to read through your piece and offer insights on this. So, so I would also recommend that you take a look at that Diverse Voices series from the Open Notebook, and consider this concept of sensitivity readers.
That's fantastic. You can, Meredith, you can speak up the next question, and I would encourage everyone to share their thoughts too. And I see folks exchanging ideas, so that's very encouraging. Meredith?
Yeah, I'm skipping ahead a little bit because there is one question that I was like, oh yes. So my own biases at the moment. It's about adjusting quotes. So person had a good interview with a researcher who kept referring to normal versus a diabetic patient, and kind of that use of normal. And, you know, in terms of journalistic standards, you don't want to mess with quotes, but then if a quote is, so what do we, I mean, my initial thinking, I was like, oh, we'll paraphrase it. But sometimes if you are always paraphrasing, you know, it's the power of the quote too. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that when you train journalists? And
well, I guess, you know, that's a really good example of language that the source probably is taking for granted. I'm sure the source didn't think twice about that language. And if you were to call their attention to it, and say, you know, we have some concerns about using this verbatim, because we don't want to imply that, you know, someone's not normal if they have diabetes or whatever, then calling that out might make the source say, oh, actually, I'd like to offer a different version of this. Or if they don't want to do that, or if you don't want to contact them again, yeah, I would try to either paraphrase or else remove part of that, you know, only take the other part of the quote. You know, like you could paraphrase the part where they say normal versus diabetic, or I'm sorry, if it was not diabetic and if I had the wrong word there, sorry, but you know what I mean. Take that part out and use the more substantive part of what they said in the quote. Obviously there are some serious judgment calls that you have to make as the writer in that case, but I think the larger lesson is the more you can raise your awareness about the very many ways that our language can exclude people, the more skilled you're going to get at raising these issues when they first arise and dealing with them.
So I am going to combine, well, two questions. One is asking what are some good examples of creative evaluation metrics? And then the other one is really about how do we reach a broader audience? A lot of times we talk about targeting audiences, and now in this context, we're talking about being inclusive. So when a lot of our, for example, visioning programs oftentimes reach one demographic, typically older, not necessarily younger audiences. So how can we be targeted, but also inclusive? I think if I'm getting that question right, if not, correct me. So One part is examples of creative evaluation metrics, and then the other is this broader versus targeted audience messaging.
So for the creative evaluation metrics, good question. Let's think about it some more. I mean, we're not prepared to offer any specific metrics in the report at this point, because there's a real gap here and we don't feel expert in this either. I will offer as an example that we were thinking about, and this is an example that we might offer in the report. We were thinking about how few of the people who are really using Twitter, for example, to do a lot of inclusive science communication are actually doing any evaluation on the outcomes or impacts or whatever of their engagement via Twitter. So we were thinking, this is an example where someone, maybe a researcher who's really interested in understanding some of these questions could partner with the Twitter user / engager person, come together, talk about this, be like, oh, hey, here are some interesting questions that I have. Can I have access to your data? And it is the collaboration of those people that leads to the creative metrics, So I can't tell you what those metrics might be, but I think that all of us don't do enough reaching out to people who do their work very differently from us and think very differently about their work. And because of that, again, we get really stuck in our ways of thinking. So if we were to reach out in the beginning of our efforts more broadly to try to bring in more collaborators, we'd be far more successful. In terms of the second question, I'm sorry, but I think I need a little bit more info.
I'm going to actually, I tried to paraphrase it and I didn't do a good job. So I'm just going to read it. What is a good strategy for programming to reach a broader audience to be more inclusive, i.e. age, without burnout? So that part I had missed. So for example, we have visioning programs that oftentimes reach one demographic, typically older, but not necessarily younger audiences, even though we use a bunch of different outlets from social media and print and digital.
Great.
platforms.
Okay, so I'm teaching a public engagement with science class right now, or I was. Now everything's all different, but I guess I still am. I'm just doing it very differently. And one of the things that we've been talking about a lot in this class is the fact that you need to go to where the people are versus expecting them to come to you. I know that's hard, but real public engagement comes from meeting people where they are. And so that's one piece of this, like getting a different, group of people to attend your programs means that you may have to do the program in different places. It's the very same program, so you say you're getting older people and you want younger people, then, find a place where the younger people are and bring the program to them. Another thing that you really need to think about is timing. So the time of day or night that you hold a program can also really determine who can come because of school or jobs or childcare or whatever. So those are some of the easiest things to think about in terms of programming and trying to make it more inclusive.
Right. I think we'll have to conclude the webinar here. I just want to be respectful of everybody's time, but thank you so much, Meredith, for making this happen. And thank you, Sunshine, for giving us your time. We learned a lot. This was terrific. And we'll continue. Colleagues, if you have questions, please feel free to share them with Meredith or myself via email, and we'll bug Sunshine to answer those questions to us. And we'll share a sheet with all of you. So thank you again. Thanks, Sunshine. Thanks, Meredith. Anything that you all have to say before we go?
Just thank you. I appreciate everybody. Take care.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sunshine.
All right, take care now. Bye-bye.